GitHub is the world's largest source code host and at the center of the developer ecosystem. And of course, GitHub also built GitHub Copilot, the first AI coding assistant, which is now used by over 1.3 million developers and over 50,000 enterprise subscribers. Today on Unsupervised Learning, we had on Thomas Dohmke, the CEO of GitHub, to share his perspective on the future of AI and coding and what he's learned about scaling Copilot. Full disclosure, before joining Redpoint, I was COO of GitHub, working alongside Thomas and others to scale GitHub and bring Copilot to market, so this episode was especially fun and special for me. If you're an AI founder or operator and interested in hearing about one of the fastest growing examples of an AI product in production, this episode is for you. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us here today. You've had an amazing journey from being a kid growing up in East Germany before the wall fell, to being a developer, to being a founder who was then acquired by Microsoft. Then you worked on the Microsoft acquisition of GitHub. And of course, rose through the ranks. Now you're CEO of GitHub, a pretty incredible place to be. What's the coolest part of being CEO of GitHub in the age of AI?
I mean, Copilot, right? We built Copilot now over 4 years ago, which seems like a really long amount of time. It's really the coolest part of the job, seeing people using it, seeing people talk about how it's helping them, how they feel it's magical, seeing our own user research coming in. I remember, some of the early stats where we couldn't actually believe that these numbers are true and that Copilot is already writing so much code, and we sent the team back and say, hey, verify that those numbers are actually right. Seeing my kids coding with it and solving their own problems in natural language, I think that's the coolest part of being the GitHub CEO. And of course, it's that I get to work with developers every day. I've been coding since the early 90s. I've gone through the rise of the internet and the rise of mobile, and now we are in the age of AI. And I truly believe we are going to we're going to enable 1 billion developers on this planet.
Yeah, it's funny when you talk about we couldn't believe the metrics. Obviously I was there when we shipped GitHub or Copilot as well. And I think it's the only time in my life where I've been at a company, we shipped something and was even better than we expected out of the gate. Like usually you're shipping too early, it's not quite there. Copilot, we were like, holy crap, this is powerful. I mean, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and I think, this has kept going ever since. Obviously there were moments in the Copilot journey where things have changed around us that opened our eyes. And one of them clearly was ChatGPT in November 2022. Right after that launch, I went on a trip to Japan, Singapore, and Australia, and all my customer conversations ever since have been around AI. Before there was a lot of skepticism. Ever since it's like, help us to adopt AI, help us to make AI part of our own strategy.
Yeah, I think it's the first time in any major platform shift where you had this like consumerization of a technology happening at the same time. And so all of a sudden, instead of having to explain to people like what cloud was, if we think about that transition, instead it's like, oh no, their kids are using it and their parents are using ChatGPT and they're understanding and seeing the power. And then they're like, wait a sec, if I can do this via some kind of consumer application, I want to be able to do this in my company as well. You talked about traveling post release of ChatGPT, and you've talked a lot in your keynotes about lowering the barrier to software development for folks around the world. I'd love to hear a little bit about that and what you've seen, especially, in some of these developing companies, you're giving people so much power. I mean, I think GitHub was doing that even before Copilot, and now it's like a whole new world of developers has opened up, which is pretty exciting. Like, what have you seen so far? What anecdotes can you share with us on that front?
I think, the first thing that comes to mind is just the power of keeping people in their creative flow. The original Copilot, had no chat and it had no agents. It was just auto-completion. Just helped you writing a text within the editor. And, auto-completion has existed for quite a while, and long before anyone was talking about the age of AI. Yet, having a large language model doing that auto-completion, being able to, show you 10 lines of code, render a whole test case, or how to connect to the cloud is incredibly powerful because it avoids that the developer has to switch from the editor to the browser, where we all have, our whole lives reflected in all the tabs that are open, and then you go on an internet search and you try to find, what you're looking for, and then you're copy and pasting that back into the editor. But by the time you're actually back in the creative process, you lost the flow. And so it wasn't so much about generative AI when we got started. It was about keeping engineers in the flow, keeping them where they have the most fun writing code. And I think Chad added another layer on top of that. And natural language plays a huge role because we're thinking, in the languages that we learned as little kids, or sometimes when we immigrated to another country in that language too. We're not thinking in code, and we're not thinking in deterministic machine language, right? And so as such, that's incredibly powerful that you can now ask questions about your code, even have it just explain your code back to you to see what you did, right? Like that sometimes the model is more honest to you than you're honest to yourself, and then you bring that from English, which is predominant, in the United States and in England and whatnot, but it's not predominant in Brazil and in Argentina and in South Africa and many other countries. And so, but those 6-7-year-olds also want to learn coding. They also want to, explore their creativity after they have played Super Mario for the first time. And so, giving them the power to say, well, I want to build a game in Brazilian Portuguese is incredibly democratizing. I think it will create a whole new way of thinking about software development, like we think about learning to play an instrument or learning to draw and all these things. It doesn't mean you have to become a professional artist. It just means you can learn it if you want to, and if your creativity is pushing you into that direction.
I mean, I would love to go a little bit deeper into how you think those changes will impact the role of the software developer in the future. You mentioned at GitHub Constellation last week that natural language is the most powerful tool for developers, and you're launching Copilot Workspace to go from idea to production with just natural language. And so what does the role of a software developer look like in, say, 5 years?
I think actually it will look very similar to today. We should not overestimate how fast the change will go, given how much software, how many lines of code exists, right? And every company I've met with and every company I ever worked for writes more code every single day than they're deleting. And many of them are still managing code bases that are, decades old. Most of the banks still run COBOL on mainframes that was developed by folks that are hopefully retired by now. And that was developed, it's easy to forget. Code developed in the 70s and 80s didn't have agile software development. It didn't have, test-driven development. It didn't have Scrum. Nobody was writing unit tests, certainly not in the sense that we're doing that today. So that those code bases still need to be maintained. And I think, what AI will do, it will make that much easier to go through, these complex systems that software developers manage today. It will make it more accessible. The hardest challenge that you have when you join a company or new project in your team is to actually learn how the team is doing their stuff, learn about the code base, learn about the stack, learn about the institutional knowledge of the team. And I think that will be much easier if you can just ask Copilot, in natural language questions about this. How do I deploy here? How do I add a library? Copilot will, do the not so fun stuff, and so you can focus on the things that you actually enjoy doing. One example that often comes to mind and that we are living ourselves, here at GitHub is that our backlogs are full, right? Like we have so many ideas ourselves, we have so many customer requests, enterprise adoption blockers, where enterprises are telling us we're not buying your product until you deliver this and that feature, often around very boring stuff like proxy support and policies and whatnot. And on the other side is, all the fundamentals, availability, scale, security, compliance, accessibility, all the things that you also have to do. And it's a rising pile, of work especially whenever a security vulnerability, goes through the internet. And so we really think that AI, agents, autofix, as we call it, Copilot autofix, will help developers to burn down these security vulnerabilities and accessibility issues and other things, so they can focus on the innovation, on this thing that really is making them happy.
You mentioned that agents is going to be a really core part of Copilot strategy going forward. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about some of the different agents that you have in mind for it?
Yeah, and by the way, Copilot itself is an agent, right? If you think about the word, there's a pilot in the cockpit and a Copilot, and a lot of the time the Copilot is actually flying the plane. So if you take it literally, Copilot in that sense is autonomous to a certain degree. Yeah, I think, in many ways developers they're already used to using agents. If you simplify the concept, CI/CD is an autonomous process that runs whenever I push my code into a repository. It runs all my test cases. It creates a log file, and then it alerts me that I have to do something. Conceptually, it works like an agent. You give it a task, and it gives you a result back. And I think most developers are looking forward to more of these things that solves their problems in the same way that we have dishwashers at home and robotic vacuums and lawnmowers and whatnot. And nobody has ever complained about having a dishwasher. You don't fear your dishwasher. You're happy that it does the work for you. And I think agents will do the same thing. Security tooling today shows you all the security issues that you have, and then you have to go and burn them down. Instead, we will have security tools that actually helps you to burn down these issues, and so you can go back to the next feature to implement.
Speaking of non-coding things like dishwashing, do you think that most industries, say in the next 5 years, once these models are even better, will still be human in the loop, or do you think that AI will replace a lot of humans in a lot of industries going forward?
I think there's certainly some industries, translators come to mind that are probably going to be replaced to a certain degree by AI, because we can just use these things to translate in real time. I'm seeing a world where I can do this podcast in German, and the listener can hear it in English, and it actually sounds like my voice, and you can pick whether you want a German accent or an American accent and things like that. I think in software development, the role won't change much. I think we will just up level. We will walk up the stack as we always have, right? Like if you think to software development in the 90s was very different before open source than after open source. Before the cloud and after the cloud, we had VMs, and now we have containers and clusters, and so we're moving up the stack, and the AI will help us doing that.
On a related note, what does that mean for, new software developers who are trying to learn and come into it? I think of, we both have kids around 12 who are really into coding, and today they're using, maybe Copilot or more autocomplete versions of AI. Over time, as AI gets more powerful and we have these more agentic ways of building things, I take your point that Copilot itself is an agent, but when I think about agents, I mean like, hey, go build me this thing or this piece of an app, this building block. You still have to kind of understand what's going on in the code in order to build the blocks and make sure you have the right blocks, and then click all the right blocks together to build the resulting app. What do you think the learning journey is going to look like? Because if we can get a lot of help, with the basic stuff, then how do we know if the more complicated things we're building are built the right way?
The way I think about this is that, AI is a layer on top of code, but code doesn't go away. The machine at the end of the day, has a processor, a CPU, and a GPU in it that both run a deterministic instruction set. And code is just an abstraction layer on top of that, so we don't have to write, machine language or assembly. And then we move from, simple coding languages to higher coding languages, and we added, thousands of open source libraries. And so that's kind of like the same thing, right? Like if you use an open source library, how often do you actually look into the code base of that open source library to understand how it works? If it does the job and everything is fine, you're probably just using it and updating it, hopefully to stay on top of security vulnerabilities. But if it doesn't work, you go and dive in and maybe you fork it on GitHub and try to debug what the problem is. And then all of a sudden now you have to become an expert in that library. The same is true, for Copilot. Copilot adds the human language as a higher abstraction layer. And when you see kids using it, you can see them exploring, ideas and they type, build me a Python game and I want to have, a sprite character, and then it gives you instructions. And as long as that actually works and you can just copy and paste it over to the editor side, they might just keep going with natural language. But as soon as things break, they have to go into the code base and try to figure it out themselves. So they need to have the understanding on both sides, but human language, in Copilot makes it more accessible to get started. And it actually, I think the biggest superpower is that it makes it easier for you to unblock yourself. Like when I learned coding in the early 90s, all I had was books and magazines, and there wasn't an internet I could dial into. I could go to Computer Club on Wednesdays and kind of like hope that somebody is there that has the same knowledge level or better knowledge level to solve my problem. And other than that, the best solution you had is go to bed and sleep and hope that in the morning you have that aha moment of unstucking yourself, or write a letter. Quite literally, the computer magazines had letters in them, letters from the readers asking questions, right? And today, or with the internet, you can go and do a Google search, and with AI, you can actually now go a step further and explore this problem yourself, highlight the code and say, where's the bug? What can I do to fix this? You can just say it doesn't work. And because, the chat window kind of like has the context of what you said before, it may tell you, well, how about you try this or how you try that? And I think our kids will learn how to do that in the same way that the kids have learned the last 10 years of how to use TikTok and YouTube and phones and make photos of the world in a very different fashion than we have become, Erica, we have become the generation that is now old and looks at the latest generation of, with the very different eyes than us as kids.
Fair, though I do have much higher hopes for AI and coding than I do for TikTok, but that's a separate podcast, I think. You talked a little bit about open source, and this is something that I think about a lot. What do you think the impact of AI-powered coding will be on the open source ecosystem over time? Now, it used to be the case that maybe you were using an open source library and you didn't really speak that language, so it made it hard for you to go in and contribute fixes. I think, Copilot and other tools really lower that barrier, obviously. I mean, there's so many potential implications, I think, of AI and lowering the barrier to coding and being able to automate more security fixing and things like that. But what happens? Do we end up with more open source? Do we have developers using AI to contribute to existing projects and those become more popular, and maybe we don't have 75 different JavaScript libraries? How do you think about the evolution of the open source ecosystem once, AI becomes even more mainstream than it is today in coding?
I hope and I think, that it will make open source even more dominant than it already is. One anecdote I can tell is that I talked, with the dad, who's also VP of engineering at a tech company the other day, and he said, he was coding with his son, and they had to convert, I don't remember, decimal into binary or something like that, and the son had written 150 lines of code, and then I went to Copilot and asked that question, and I basically got 2 lines of code: the import statement for an open source library and the method call, right? And so it increases the usage for open source by, if you, and the same happens in ChatGPT and other coding tools, they automatically, because they were trained on so much internet information, they automatically suggest the usage of open source projects, because that's in the training set that what real developers would also suggest, if you ask that question. And then you can go and say, well, do that, but don't use an open source library, and you still get better code than the code that you wrote yourself. And so I think it will increase the usage as naturally these AI systems will suggest the usage of open source to solve a problem. I think it will make the life of a maintainer easier. You already mentioned, burning down security issues, just managing issues, summarizing, a discussion in the morning. There's the little things in the life that AI makes already much easier. And I think it will increase the number of contributors. Today, one of the biggest challenges you have is if you use an open source library and you find an issue or you have a feature request, now you take this and you want to learn about this code base and you want to understand how it works and you want to do the right things because you otherwise fear that when you open that pull request and you didn't write the right test cases or you didn't follow the right structure that the maintainers have institutionalized in the project, you're going to get rejected. And then nobody wants to get rejected, especially not if they're doing free work during their hobby time. So I think it's influencing the work of software developers on the consumption, on the maintainer, and the contribution side. And as such, it will create an even bigger, growth for open source. And the other day, Meta published the latest Llama model, and Mark Zuckerberg talked about how he sees open source and how important it will be. So I think we're going to see even more open source and more sharing through the use of AI.
I completely agree with you there. I will say, I might be a VC now, but I am forever a COO in my heart. And so I've always been all about efficiency, right? And you just use the example of, hey, instead of writing this code, it just pulled in an open source library, which is what we want. And I think how we can together jointly build better software over time. I think the question though there is, are AI models going to start favoring specific open source projects because they're higher quality or whatever it might be? They show up more in the training data. It's probably a good thing because then maybe we don't have people who didn't find that open source project, so go and start another one. There's a lot of creativity and amazing creation and innovation in open source, but there's a lot of duplication and there's a lot of waste. And so one of the questions I've been asking myself is, do we start kind of consolidating around specific key open source projects even more so today? So when, we want to go and create something new, it's truly net new instead of duplicating things, because these AI systems are going to keep choosing and reusing the same components instead of going out and building something new every time.
Maybe. I think, in some ways it does exactly what humans do, which is when you pick a framework to build a new web application, you're likely erring on the side of which are the big projects and have the most maintainers and the most longevity, React or Next as examples. You can still use jQuery if you want to, but, if you're up to date on the state of software development, you probably stay away from that. While an open source, not an open source, while a large language model might actually look at what you have in your editor, what you have in your project already, and uses that as context, to suggest, keep using the frameworks you already have. If you think about the magic behind Copilot, even the original Copilot was that it uses everything that you already have in your file, above the cursor, below the cursor, it does fill in the middle, it uses adjacent tabs. You can actually intentionally open tabs to give it more context, and it uses that, in a computational way to create embeddings and a context, a prompt, if you will, that you don't see. And as such, it does give you, answers that are in relation to the project you're working on. Otherwise, you wouldn't get JavaScript code. If you're in a JavaScript file, you would just get, code that the model thinks is the best one. So I think it will swim somewhere in the middle of, leveraging the context that you have, that you have in your IDE, in your editor. But it will also, obviously promote the biggest libraries as do, tech sites and blogs and ultimately developers themselves. I think the consolidation is a good question of how that might work. And if we at some point get into a place where we have specialized models, custom models or smaller models, that are part of a company's workflow, or retrieval, serves the same purpose. Where a company, like Shopify says, well, we're working on Ruby on Rails, and we have certain patterns and certain ways of doing things, and we customize Copilot to the degree that our developers also always follow those standards. And don't go away and start using Go or some other language that just is the hottest new thing.
Going a little bit deeper there, you're releasing fine-tuning for Copilot soon. Would love to hear, your thoughts on that, and what do you think the impact will be?
It's one of the most requested features, especially by enterprise customers, as a lot of them are just sitting on old code bases and have certain way of writing applications and using internal libraries. That the model training will never know about, given that those internal libraries, think C, C++ specifically, are not becoming open source, and the ecosystem there is very different than more modern languages that have package managers. And so tuning will work that, you go to your GitHub organization and pick a couple of repos and basically say, I want a fine-tuned model for that. And the tuning process will run. And then your projects, when you check them out in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio or JetBrains, it will automatically use that fine-tuned model. And as such, you're basically getting a tailored Copilot, but you don't actually have to go into the data science, and you don't have to understand parameters. It's really just customize your Copilot from the user interface, and you get better results.
We've talked a little bit about the original Copilot being so good and, surprised at the traction that it received. When you think about, the last few years, what has been the hardest part about evolving Copilot and the development process of that?
The being so good piece is actually interesting, because you could also say the complete opposite, which is like it often hallucinates and it often outputs, code that is not perfect. And I think the interesting piece about that is that it's true for every code written out there. Like whether you use a Copilot or not, naturally when you try to find code snippets that help you to solve a problem, an algorithm or an API access, or making rounded corners for an iPhone app, you find code in the internet that is in almost any case not perfect, and you have to go and modify it. And so the model hallucinates is actually not a bad thing per se, because developers are already used to take code and modify it for their needs. And as such, the original Copilot was good because it already knew your variable names and already knew what you had written above. So it was closer to the perfect answer than most GitHub, Reddit, Stack Overflow answers can ever be. And I think that's the middle ground there, that it's like we're raising the average. We're not trying to be perfect. We're raising the average, and as the models get better and as the systems get better, those averages also get better. And I think as we look forward, we will see better models. We will definitely see better customization. We haven't really talked about extensions yet, but I think that's a super important part, because almost no project is built on top of a programming language alone, right? There's lots of other services that come into play, even more so if you go into commercial, professional software development, where you usually have a stack, a platform engineering stack that is highly custom for each individual company. You likely will not find two companies that use exactly the same set of tools, unless they just all came out of Y Combinator and somebody recommended that to every founder in the class, right? And so, some use LaunchDarkly, and some use Statsig, and some use, Azure, and some use AWS, right? And so you want to basically pull that information also into the Copilot, into Copilot chat, and be able to say, okay, here in my team, in my project, that's how we're doing it. And so I want all my answers to be tailored for that. And if I ask, how to create a feature flag, I get basically here's your LaunchDarkly connection. And if you want to create that feature flag right from chat, you can do so. And you can also ask whether the feature flag is enabled. So I think that extensibility layer on top of the better models and better RAG and better fine-tuning is crucially important, because even if you have the best model that knows it all, it still will not know what you're actually doing in your stack. And so you need to have these connections to the systems that you either have internally or externally.
And along the same lines, what has surprised you in the last 4 years about Copilot? Are there any use cases or ways that users are using it that you didn't expect originally?
I don't think we expected originally that things would move so fast. The project was started in something that we call GitHub Next, which is a team that sits outside of engineering a product and works kind of like on research projects. But I'm putting research into like quotes, because it's not research in the sense of we're trying to write papers and publish and reinvent the wheel. It's more about thinking about the future of software development, Horizon 3, if you will. And I think the Horizon 3 with Copilot really was more like a Horizon 1.8. And as time went by, it quickly became the current Horizon. And nowadays you can't really talk about Horizon 3 anymore because everything that you work in the terms of AI has at best a 6 months horizon, and after that you have to rethink and reconfigure what you're working on anyways. And I think that pace and also the adoption, the diffusion, the Copilot has crossed the chasm. It's no longer about the early adopters. It's about whether you're in the early majority or in the late majority in getting it and using it, and then thinking about what's next on that journey. And I think that's the, what we're really surprised about. And, I couldn't have predicted that 4 years ago.
And it's really remarkable how quickly that has happened. I mean, this is certainly, from my personal experience, the quickest I've ever seen technology go from, hey, is this even going to work, to like mainstream adoption in the enterprise, no less, as opposed to consumer, where sometimes we see things take off more quickly. You talked about in your TED Talk about how there have been these like 3 major breakthroughs in 3 years, thanks to AI. What are you thinking about in the next 3 years? Like, is the pace sustainable? What are the next major milestones that we're going to see, and what's the time frame for those?
I want to say the pace is not only sustainable, but accelerates, because we're using now AI to build the AI systems. And so we can build much more in the same amount of times. And as we, hopefully get more of these agents into the process where we can just burn through our security backlog and burn through our accessibility backlog. And in fact, if you think about accessibility today, when you want to ship an accessible web page, you have to go through your code and make sure that all the images have an alt tag and things like that you have right contrast and right font sizes, using fixed pixel fonts and whatnot. You could also see a world where, the person that has the vision impairment has a device that shows them the world exactly how a person without a vision impairment sees the world. And so you don't have to actually take care of accessibility anymore, because the device, the Geordi LaForge visor, from Star Trek, kind of helps them see the world. And the question really is, how do we bridge the gap between that state where we can see the world, with the help of AI, and where we still need to do work as developers. Same for security, hopefully we burn through the security backlog. But once you have done that, then the question is, how do you stay clean? And how do you, leverage agents now to not reintroduce security vulnerabilities? How do you not downgrade on a version of React because one side of the company didn't know that the other side has already moved, to the latest release due to a security vulnerability. And so I think we are going to see an acceleration, because we make our life easier by spending more time on the innovation side and less time on let's be honest, the side that most developers are not excited about when they look at their security dashboard and the compliance items that the lawyers just gave them because the AI Act is rolling out in Europe and DMA and DSA and whatnot. Right, and so I think that's the pace of the pace will hopefully accelerate because we needed to accelerate. We have lots of problems to solve, and predicting what that will be is hard, right? Like, you couldn't have predicted, where we are today 3 years ago. But I think we will see innovation across the whole stack. It's actually super exciting, that we have chip companies in Silicon Valley, chip startups in Silicon Valley again. Now they're not building their own chips; they're outsourcing that to TSMC. But they're designing GPUs that run transformer models faster, and similar use cases. We will see innovation across models. We will hopefully see innovation in the responsible AI stack, making that easier, to use these models in the most optimal and secure and ethical way. And we will certainly see a lot of innovation in the app and higher layers that we can't even think of today.
Are there parts of the development stack that you don't think are consumed by AI in the long term? Right now, for example, we have companies focused on just testing and using AI code development for that, for application security and finding vulnerabilities. Are there certain parts of the stack that are not going to be as impacted as much?
I can't think of any. I mean, I think, we're going to see, shifts everywhere because we need those shifts. I think the better question is, which part of, an organization, especially in software development, doesn't need the efficiency gains from AI, doesn't need the productivity gains. I mean, we all have too many Slack messages and too many emails, and we're really fighting ultimately, and that goes back to TikTok, is that we have only limited amount of time every single day, and we have certainly limited amount of attention, and everything wants to grab that attention, and whether it's in personal life and consuming videos, and that has already shifted. I don't think my kids understand linear TV because we never had any, ever since they were born. We had YouTube and Netflix and Disney Plus, right? And so it's kind of like when they go to their grandparents and they watch TV and they're like, why do we cannot pause the programming now and have dinner, right? And I think the same is true, in this new world of artificial intelligence. We are going to shift. And I actually, by the way, think the term artificial intelligence is scary from a wording perspective. If you think about the gains and how it makes our life better and how it makes the world better, we're going to see a dramatic shift of how we think about that.
There's obviously a lot of companies that have raised a lot of money to go after code generation, building foundation models for either general code generation or specific things like testing. Do you think this is a winner-takes-all market? Do you think that there will be foundation models for application security, for testing, for code generation? How do you sort of view the market?
I don't think there's anything in tech that is winner takes all. And even those that believe they were the winner that took it all eventually got disrupted by new technology. And if you look at Microsoft, which is turning 50 years old next year, is the reason that Microsoft is still relevant is that we reinvented ourselves, given that we as GitHub are part of Microsoft multiple times. And in fact, GitHub to a certain degree reinvented itself with Copilot, and last year at GitHub Universe I said GitHub was refounded on Copilot, and that doesn't mean that all our legacy is no longer relevant, but we leveraged the new AI technology to build something that certainly changed the world with Copilot. And I think there's going to be more such companies, and competition is great. You wouldn't want to watch a sports game that only has one team competing against itself. You want 18 teams or whatever league, or 10 Formula One teams with 2 cars each or whatnot, and you're rooting, of course, for your favorite team, and then so of course I want to win the competition, and then a year or a decade is over, and then you have to do it all over again, right? Like, just because you won the world championship this year doesn't mean you win next year again. And I think that's really how to think about this. Most companies play the infinite game, right? Like, they're playing Minecraft, not Super Mario, in the long run, but in the short term, of course, they play little mini games within Minecraft. And I think that's how you need to think about business, and that's how startups need to think about their journey. Like, sure, there's maybe an exit, but an exit is just you're merging into the next game, and you keep playing with the merged company or in the public markets.
Your own journey is a prime example of that. And I love the F1 reference, right? Like, Red Bull needed Mercedes to get to the point that they were at, and McLaren certainly has needed them.
Well, and let's not forget, Mercedes needed Red Bull too, right? Like, it's not too long ago that Lewis Hamilton won it all for many years in a row, and then came the fantastic 21 season, and ever since it's been a bit the reverse. Yeah.
Yeah, and made it a lot more fun to watch, in my humble opinion. Going back to the model question, totally agree with you on this isn't a winner-take-all market. We certainly need several successful companies for all the reasons that you talked about. When you think about within a particular enterprise, though, how do you think about this playing out over time? Do you think companies are going to use multiple models specifically for code? Let's just focus on code for this. And are they going to use specific coding models? And then will they also have other models that might be helping with documentation and testing? Or is your view that, these models are getting so powerful, you can already write tests with Copilot, as far as I know, and you can already use it to help with docs and things like that? Like, how does this play out, and how many models does an enterprise end up using specifically for code-related work?
As long as they're using Copilot, I'm fine, by the way. And I don't care what model they're also using. I mean, Copilot today is using many models, different ones from OpenAI, 3.5 turbo for auto completion and 4 turbo for chat and 4.0 for workspace. And of course, we're constantly upgrading these models, and behind the scenes there's smaller, dot versions of these models that we don't even talk about, but that make the product better. But there's also, a smaller model within the responsible AI pipeline that scans and fixes security vulnerabilities that you never get to see, but you're using it, as you're using the Copilot stack. And obviously, as soon as you're also using other tools within your engineering stack, I already mentioned a few, like Slack and their AI tooling, or Atlassian has an AI agent. You're using the models that are behind those tools. So I think as everybody is using multiple tools, it's kind of like you're asking the question: are companies going to use more than one SaaS service within their IT stack or within their engineering stack? And the answer absolutely is yes. And as such, they're naturally going to have multiple models for multiple use cases. And within CodeGen alone, there's so many things that that are outside of GitHub. If you think about data collection with telemetry and insights with Datadog or Google Analytics, or which requires probably a time series model to predict anomalies and or that you have to scale up and things like that. I think the vision is another topic that sure, there's multimodal models, but then there's other use cases where you might want a specific vision model to render videos or render images in your application. So I think this is a multimodal world, and to some degrees, from an investor perspective, we're overthinking that a little bit. There's the one model that rules them all. Like I don't see that actually being true, and certainly not if you go into biotech and you think about models to prevent or treat cancer, as an example.
I could have asked that question differently, which is really, is there room for multiple products? It's not really about the models, it's about the products, right? And from an investor perspective, we see companies that are entirely focused on testing or entirely focused on cleaning up tech debt, right? And so one of the topics that we discuss internally and certainly have points of view on is, like, how is this going to evolve over time as the co-pilots of the world themselves get more powerful? Like, is it really going to make sense for a company to buy and use Copilot, but then go and procure a different product, regardless of underlying models, for one specific part of the software development lifecycle?
Yeah, I think they're already doing that. I think they're already doing that today, where they're combining, let's just take the security landscape, where they're combining multiple security vendors, and they have the choice between the one that has it all and maybe a bit more shallow than the customer likes, or they pick the best of breed, as applications and combine them together. Most companies also are so diverse that they have many teams doing different things, even if the bosses say you can only use that one stack, whether it's on the programming language side, whether it's on the IDE side, certainly within the cloud stack, there's so many combinations. And as companies evolve, and evolve these days means every 6 months, there's the hottest new thing, and that developers will jump onto. So I think there's certainly a world where multiple AI developer tools will coexist within the stack.
We've seen sort of this shift to power going to the incumbents just because they yield distribution with AI. You have a really unique perspective because you founded 2 companies and now you're the CEO of GitHub. And so if you sort of put your founder hat on, what would you advise founders today in terms of being able to go up against the incumbents with AI now?
Yeah, I already mentioned, the one that I think is most important, which is to play the long game, to play the infinite game, and think about the big picture, at least at certain times during the week, and not focus too much on the small battles, because, I think the one thing I've learned as I grow older and in my career and also in life is that, while we have, almost a extreme sense of urgency these days, to a certain degree, that because Amazon delivers everything within a couple of hours, especially when you live on the West Coast, right? And so you want every feature also within a couple of hours, and every update to your house and every change. Who wants to wait for a car for 9 months these days? If Tesla can get you the latest model, in front of your door by the next day, and even that, Tesla cannot always realize. But I think we more long-term thinking over like the short-term battles is, I think, helpful for startup founders to even realize why they're doing what they're doing. Along those lines, I think it's super important to continuously reconfigure as a company. There is no stable state anymore. You're only surviving if you're constantly evolving. VCs like to think about the pivot and talk about that, and I think has a certain negative connotation unless the pivot resulted in a Slack, that became massive. But I think in reality, it's like you need to constantly adapt to what's happening, especially in technology, but also within your product. As you find product market fit, there's not really a step function. Now you have product market fit, and for the rest of your life, you're good, right? You constantly have to find new product market fit and retain or grow your position in the market. And so as such, your team has to change, and your organization has to change along your growth journey. And then, I think my favorite thing, especially since I became the GitHub CEO, is like you have to say no all the time. No to all the new ideas, no to all the investment areas. As you grow the company, the biggest danger you have is that now you have 1,000 people or 3,000 people, or, at the scale of Microsoft, hundreds of thousands of people. You still have to say no to most of the ideas. And I think was Apple or even Steve Jobs that said, 1,000 no's for every single yes. And I think let's not forget that. That's the true power of a startup, is focus, focus, focus. But you have to keep that focus even as you grow and even as you find success.
Yep. No, so one of the main things we look for on the investment side, and one of the hardest things that we see founders have to deal with, is saying no. The GitHub ecosystem is incredibly diverse, and a lot of founders are trying to tap into that ecosystem. And you launched the extensions program, which is super cool. What are certain areas that you'd love to see more extensions being published today?
You'd love to see them across the whole stack, because if you have them across the whole stack, basically all the tools that companies use, within their software development teams, the more powerful Copilot becomes. And so, as if you're a software development provider and you're building tools, we'd love to invite you into the partner program. We actually have seen now customers that are directly telling developer tools providers to build a Copilot extension because they want their stack mapped into Copilot. They want platform engineering to be in the natural language interface, so you no longer have to go to 15 portals and figure out what account are you using and how do you have the right access rights and all that. If you think about that, all that mapped into Copilot, into the IDE, is incredibly powerful. And so we hope, that we see more extensions. And, I mentioned accessibility as an example, security, compliance things. There's a lot of white space in that area where developers can build cool stuff that makes developers' lives easier.
Are those your top kind of priority areas where you'd love to see more developed? Are there any other things that you'd love to see founders thinking about adding as an extension?
I think the true power of the next wave of Copilot is that mix of extensions and agents, of thinking about code completion to a certain as to solve problems. You can make it better by customizing and fine-tuning and writing more code. But eventually there is the curve will flatten, because you can't really predict what the developer wants to do until they have given more input. You won't be able to predict the whole file by just typing 3 characters at the beginning of a file. And if you can do that, then you probably want to use an open source library, because you're just rewriting what already exists out there. So I think, as auto-completion, to a certain degree is a solved problem, then the next thing is, the rest of the development stack and scanning a file for vulnerabilities and then fixing those vulnerabilities, reviewing code, from a coding standards perspective or from a refactoring perspective, multi-file edits, predicting the next step after the current step, and ultimately, understanding a code base, imagine, one of your startups would hire me today, I have a lot of software development experience. I would still struggle, initially with their code base, understanding it, figuring out where to change which file. Submitting the first pull request as a new employee in a company is scary. And they can, hopefully they have great culture and they give you a warm welcome. But, I think the more developers help Copilot to understand the context of the project they're working in, the better, AI will become, and really, get us to that next step change.
Yeah, that's something that I think a lot. And when I reflect on my time at GitHub as well, we were always moving around teams and moving engineers to new projects, depending on where we wanted to focus for the quarter. And, there's always this ramp up period on something new. And in particular, when you have a code base that's as mature as GitHub's, there's a lot of surface area to cover. And I think, this opens up a whole new kind of set of opportunities to move folks around, to learn to work on different things, to ramp much more quickly. And to your point, there's like so much work to be done just in the code bases that exist today. Copilot and other tools can really help us there to play a little bit of catch up, perhaps.
And one thing that is underestimated is that just filing an issue, whether it's as a product manager, a feature request, or as a open source user, a bug report, more often than not, these issues are way too little. They need to be more specific, right? They need more details. They need to have more context. So if you have an AI agent within the issue form, along the lines of what we're doing in Copilot Workspace that actually understands the code base and then can tell you, well, what you described here isn't good enough. Here's a spec, for what you just said, and you can edit the spec and basically iterate with the help of an agent, and I don't think we would, be scared of that kind of agent taking away our job. It's more like, oh, this is great because now I can, reflect on my own thoughts and make them better.
Yeah, freeing up humans' time to do what humans do best and automating the things that are just toil at the end of the day. This has been fantastic. We're running out of time. We have a final section we like to do called Quickfire. I'm going to move us into that, even though I think Jordan and I could ask you questions for several more hours if we all had the time. But moving into Quickfire, just rapid answers as they come to mind. What do you think is overhyped versus underhyped in AI today?
Overhyped, I think, AGI and also the fear of AGI. Underhyped, the impact that AI has on biotech and climate change and all the other things that are a bit further away from traditional tech.
You just mentioned that the fear of AGI is overhyped, but does anything about Gen AI scare you?
No.
Not even as a parent?
No, I couldn't be more excited.
Huh. I'm excited, but I worry a little bit about deepfakes and just making sure that we're always keeping up with technology around deepfakes and making sure that it doesn't have an adverse impact on our society. But I hear you on that one.
AI will protect us from deepfakes. AI, screen time, is a big topic in our house, and I can't wait for AI to say, well, coding is good. You had enough gaming today. Instead, I have to basically create exclusions for VS Code and Python in the screen time logic on Mac OS and iOS. And then the same with books and podcasts. Those are totally fine all day round.
Yeah, actually, Jordan and I invested in a company recently that is helping protect us from deepfakes. So we're very much aligned there. Which incumbent besides GitHub and Microsoft have you been most impressed with the way that they've executed on their AI strategy?
I mean, how can I not say NVIDIA, which has been remarkable over the last 2 years.
What is one thing that you thought would work with Copilot that didn't, and one thing that you thought wouldn't work that did?
Well, I'm a skeptic German and a developer. So when we first started, looking into this, I didn't believe any of it. And then it did work. And I remember, that Zoom session where we for the first time asked, GPT 3 back then to write code, and it did. And then we were in JavaScript or whatever, and then we asked it in Python, and it actually had the correct syntax. And I couldn't believe that it is able to put the commas and the colons and whatnot in the right position, given that the model doesn't actually have a compiler built into it. And I think on the other side of that is, we didn't believe that chat would work, and it did. So certainly ChatGPT opened our eyes that you can have this kind of like conversation with the AI.
And which AI startup are you most excited about right now?
There's a lot of them. I really like what Runway is doing. I mentioned silicon companies. I'm an investor in Edged AI, but there's many more. And then there's, a bunch of them that are still in stealth mode, so I can't talk about them. But it's biotech. I mentioned that as an example. It's super exciting to me.
And last one, you have a very cool job running GitHub, but if you were not doing that, what AI application would you build?
Well, if I not be doing GitHub, that means somebody pushed me out of GitHub, so I would build the next GitHub.
Nice. Great answer.
I love that. What a way to wrap up the podcast. Thomas, thanks so much for being here with us today. It's been a ton of fun. Really appreciate your time. Can't wait to see what's next from GitHub.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that was certainly a lot of fun for me. Obviously, I've known Thomas for a long time. We worked together during my time at GitHub, where he was in various roles before becoming CEO, and I was COO. So this was a bit of nostalgia for me, but how is it for you, Jordan?
Yeah, it's always cool when you've seen someone speak through various keynotes and videos online and stuff, then you finally get to actually chat with them. And I was super impressed. I mean, I thought the episode was great, and then a lot of just really interesting areas that we can talk about now. One of them I thought was interesting was around the future of developers. He obviously has a perspective that the developer will never go away, and natural language is their most powerful tool. I have a slightly different perspective, which is I do think the number of developers that you will need over time is going to decrease. Particularly in the areas of, say, front-end tooling, even back-end as well. My perspective is, infrastructure and building really sophisticated sort of next-gen products will never go away. You'll still need, developers to really think through, complex sort of workflows and things like that. But I do think it's going to be impacted a bit more than he thinks. So I'm curious your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think he can say anything else given his role and who they sell to. I mean, GitHub's MO has always been sell to the developer hearts first, right? And then the business will follow. So it doesn't surprise me that he says that, and that to some degree he has that perspective just because of his day-to-day. I do think the number of developers needed within any particular company will absolutely go down. I think there's a lot of manual and rote tasks that'll go away. I mean, look, we've already seen this with QA, right? You see far fewer QA roles than there used to be just because of automation, and AI takes this to an entirely different level. And so I think there's going to be a lot of roles that are subsumed by AI. I do think, going back to our conversation about the learning journey, it's going to be interesting to see how we actually take people, like, I love to talk about my 12-year-old, obviously, but like, I think about what his coding journey will look like over time. And right now, of course, he's using mostly autocomplete, and he's getting help when he's learning a new language or something like that. But like, how do you take someone from learning how to code to being able to understand these more complex tasks and more complex coding projects or code bases, as you talked about, when a lot of the more basic stuff is going to be done for them. So the learning journey is going to be very different. The one other thing that I'd say is, while I think the number of developers within a particular company or to build a particular product will go down, I think we're going to see a lot more companies. Like, the barrier to building software and creating apps is going to come down so much. I think we're going to see a lot more kind of micro businesses, a lot more competition in certain segments of the market. It's this whole unleashing of human creativity that's going to be really cool. How that plays out over time, how some of those grow into big companies, I think still remains to be seen.
Totally. I agree with all of that for what it's worth. I think we're also going to see a lot of non-traditional, non-developers move into developing as a result of all of this. So definitely interesting, for the future what will happen. What areas of the conversation do you think were the most interesting?
I was actually just going to ask you this. I think maybe it's obvious to us and it's obvious to Thomas, but he talked a little bit about how Copilot is it's not like it's just Copilot sitting on top of OpenAI, which some people might envision it that way. It's actually a ton of different models and even versions of different OpenAI models coming together to provide this end-to-end like software development experience. How do you think about his comments about, multi-model versus the bigger models subsuming some of these tasks over time, like security vulnerability fixing, like test writing, et cetera?
I do agree with him. I think that we are going to have a multi-model world because depending on the use case and which part of the pipeline you're in, you will need, more cost-effective models. Obviously, cost is coming down as a whole, but that's one facet of it. You will need the best performing model for specific types of use cases. You may need a smaller model to be able to run effectively on device, for example. And so I think depending on the use case and what you're aiming for and what the goal is, you'll need a model for different use cases.
What else stood out to you from the conversation? Any surprises in there or anything you felt particularly interesting?
Yeah, I guess one area, was interesting talking about what scares you. And, he said, nothing. I'm all in on AI. And for what it's worth, I love what's going on in the world with AI. And I'm very, very bullish on the future from a positive perspective. I do think, what you said, the deepfake detection side of things, I think is really important. I already know people that have been scammed from AI. And so I think that that's one area. And so while I do agree with him, whether it's even bio benefits from AI or, different sort of areas in addition to just code generation, I do think having a little bit of skepticism and understanding of the implications of it is also healthy too.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. I mean, I think AI is going to bring more good than harm by a very considerable margin. And I'm excited about the future and what it may look like and how we might free up human brains to do work that humans are uniquely well suited to do and maybe eliminate a lot of toil that is just not super productive. But I think we need to be really thoughtful about how we bring this powerful technology into the world. And certainly there's a lot of great things that are going to come out of it, but also some scary things. I mean, deepfake just being one of them. But I think you gave some other examples too. So, Thomas has always been, I think, a really positive optimist, even though, he talks about being a skeptical German. I think both things are true in his case. But yeah, I think my reaction might be a little bit more measured to him in terms of what's coming down the pipes with AI. One of the things he mentioned that we didn't get to dig into, but I think is really interesting, is how much COBOL and legacy code exists in the world. But COBOL is a unique challenge and opportunity for AI, I think, because most of the COBOL developers have retired, and we have these incredibly important systems that are powering a huge part of the US government, a huge part of our financial infrastructure, and hospitals, all kinds of really mission critical software. What's going to happen with AI? Is AI going to learn COBOL and just maintain these systems? Or over time, are AI tools going to get so powerful that we actually can realistically re-implement these systems in more modern technology?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And COBOL does come up quite a lot as of the last few months, for sure. There's actually some startups going after just this use case of converting COBOL to more modern code. And so I do think that is a use case that can be solved by AI. At this point, there's so few COBOL developers, to your point, and it's sort of dying off the number of people that can actually deal with this. And so I do think it's a good use case for AI, provided that the banks and all the various institutions that are built on it are actually open to that idea and sort of touching these really, really important parts of the code base for the actual economy and our government. So as long as they're willing to do that, I do think it's a good use case.
It feels like they're going to have to at some point? Like, for how long can we keep these fairly obsolete technologies powering systems, and like, how do you even maintain them over time? And
Totally.
are they running as efficiently, and are they as powerful as they could otherwise be? It's exciting to think about being able to finally modernize some of the critical infrastructure in our country, just to help us continue to, evolve that technology to meet our ever-changing needs.
Well, Erica, I know that I really enjoyed this episode. I thought it was really interesting, and I think our listeners will really enjoy it too.
I had a blast recording it, and I sure hope so.